open your Bibles to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 8, beginning in verse 22. Now, as I read, I want you not only follow along, but when we get to verse 25, join me reading out loud. So let's read verse 25, all of us together. So I want you to be part of it, okay? Verse 22. One day he got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side of the lake." So they set out. And as they sailed, he fell asleep. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water and were in danger. And they went out and woke him, saying, "Master, Master, we are perishing." And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was a calm. He said to them, "Where is your faith?" And they were afraid, and they marveled, saying to one another, "Who then is this, that he commands even winds and water, and they obey him?" You may be seated. Thank you so much. I want to invite you to read again the same passage, now with a different mindset. Here's why. As I was preparing for today, and I was thinking through our reading, and I caught myself, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm generalizing and putting you in the wrong category, but as I was thinking of myself sitting in the pew and one other pastor preaching, when I open the Bible and follow along as the preacher reads the passage, I look at the passage and I have this kind of thought. Maybe you have a different one. Oh, I wonder what he found in this passage. I wonder what he dug out of this. I wonder if he made some interesting observations. I'm whetting my appetites to see how the pastor will come across this passage and what he discovered. I'm anticipating something. It's not bad, it's good. I hope maybe a couple of you are thinking this way. But sadly, we're living in the world that loosens up and makes us more and more into contributors rather than participants in the study or reading or anything else. We're just passively waiting what will be served us. It's not necessarily bad, but I want to push back a little bit and say, why don't we read it again right now? And you think of not what Pastor Dmitry will find in this passage, but you find stuff in it. Why don't you find some stuff and just make observations as we read and just kind of think of if you were to preach right after that, okay? So imagine you ought to come up and preach in this passage after I'm done reading, okay? Let's see if that changes our reading. Let's read it again. So all of you preachers, join me. One day he got into a boat and with his disciples, and he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side of the lake." So they set out. And as they sailed, he fell asleep. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water and were in danger. And they went and woke him, saying, "Master, Master, we are perishing." And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was a calm. He said to them, "Where is your faith?" And they were afraid, and they marveled, saying to one another, "Who then is this, that he commands even winds and water, and they obey him?" All right. How many of you are ready to go up and preach? A couple of you. Sorry, I prepared the message. I cannot just let it sit. So you need to wait for maybe next Sunday or at group. You just preach it during your small group time. But we need to learn to work with text. And I want to work with you because as I was reading for the first time, preparing for this message a while back, a few days ago, I read it and I know this story well. And honestly, I first thought, is there enough to speak for an hour? And I began read and study and turning every word and looking under. So let's now study and look at this passage. A few words that really jump from the page of our study, from the text that we just read. Number one, the word desperation. Being desperate. I think that's the first word that caught my attention. As I'm reading this, I think disciples were in a very desperate situation. You've been in desperate. You know what desperate situation is? Let's say your house is on the path of Hurricane Ian, right? You would probably start remembering words like desperation, hopelessness, and other words. Or if you are living in a country that's at war right now, you would feel desperation. Or the word cancer, or famine, or no money to pay the bills next month. The word desperation sometimes comes unexpectedly. I mean, kids, you probably know that word as well. How many of you know this word, being desperate? Okay. Some children don't. I will remind you, what will you feel tomorrow morning when your parents wake you up and say, school? What do you feel at that moment? Desperation. When you come from school tomorrow, come home, and the very first word you hear from your parents, homework, you feel desperate. Like, this is end. My life is ruined. There's no life. Now, I imagine for you guys who are in first grade, let me tell you, 10 more years of joy of school, you would feel very desperate. You will be really broken down, and some of you will be tomorrow. But today is the day, right, that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice. But we all do that. And young people feel desperate and hopeless, not getting married. Even children, I've seen in my life situations in the eyes of children whose parents are divorcing. Just imagine the kid who is 5-year-old, loves mom and dad both, cannot explain, wants them both, and they're separating. It's a pain that I want you to understand how desperate and hopeless that child is. There's no way out. Well, this is what happens in our story because disciples were hopeless. They even pronounced not judgment, but verdict over themselves. We are perishing. Now, another word that I want us to look at is the word miracle. At times when we study the passage, we go back in the previous context, and that leads to the study that we do right now in our verse. But today I want to look forward. What's to come next few Sundays? What we're going to study, because we are in chapter 8, and we will have 4 miracles. 4 miracles. The one that we're studying today, Jesus calms the storm on the lake in Galilee. So that's number 1. Right after they get to the shore, they meet a man who is demon-possessed. Jesus casts out demons out of this man. A miracle. Then, walking in the town, another man, a leader in synagogue, invites Jairus. He invites Jesus to come and heal his daughter who is sick. And on the way, he actually by accident, almost heals another woman that was sick, and she could not heal, she could not resolve this issue for years, and he healed her. A miracle of healing. By the time they get to the Jairus place, his daughter is dead, and Jesus raises from the dead that daughter, and that concludes our chapter. And we can see all these stories have a few themes that run through, and we're studying it right now. We're beginning to look at it. Number one, miracles. So one thing for sure, you walk away from this chapter feeling Jesus is a miracle maker. He has power over the nature. He has power over spirits or evil spirits and demons. He has power over disease. He has power over death. And that concludes, wow. So at the end of this chapter, you must be convinced Jesus has power, authority, strength. Jesus is very strong. He has dominion over nature, spiritual world, illness, even death. Also, theologically, we need to understand one interesting dynamic, and this is something we tend to miss or confuse. When we get to this word Jesus is strong, we kind of develop in our thinking a little packet where we put this information. Jesus is strong. And I know Jesus also loves. And Jesus is patient. Jesus is merciful. And we have all kinds of pockets for his attributes. And he's almighty and all-knowing, and other attributes of Jesus and God come to mind. And we kind of have pockets. But think of power, especially power, like holiness. Holiness penetrates all of it. Same thing, power. What good there is in Jesus' love if he has no power to exercise that love? What good is there in mercy if that mercy cannot be applied in any situation, or faithfulness, or anything else? Jesus' power and strength makes all other attributes very applicable. And so we need to understand, as we study this, as we look at Jesus' strength and power and authority, we should apply it everywhere. As a matter of fact, even today, we're remembering that Jesus has power to forgive sins. Now, what reaction people should walk away with from encounters like this? Verse 25 gives it away. And they were afraid, and they marveled. They were afraid. And that's the main lesson. Awe, reverence, respect, hope, trust, or better to say, fear. That's all encompassing. It includes all of those attitudes. Awe, reverence, respect, everything in one word: fear the Lord. Another very important observation that we need to make: all of these four miracles, either the sea miracle, either demon-possessed man, or disease, or death, all those miracles, and as a matter of fact, all of Jesus' miracles ever done, they all begin with one common thing. They all begin with a problem. There's always a problem that causes miracle. Jesus always resolves something. He comes and says, oh, this is wrong, this is breaking, this is dead, this is sick, this is not working, they're sinking. I'm gonna restore, I'm gonna make it good again. He restores everything. He resolves problems. Why we need to make that observation? Because you probably, as good theologians, should ask this question. Well, why don't we work before the miracle is needed? Right? If Jesus raised his daughter from dead, why don't we prevent death? If this woman was healed from her disease, why don't we go ahead and just prevent that disease? Why would we prevent that demon possession? We should prevent even the storm on the sea. Jesus, why don't you just, before you get in the boat, say, oh, by the way, nice sailing. fall asleep. I would do that. I mean, nobody will wake you up throughout the night. You will have a really nice, good sleep. But he doesn't. So he has the power to resolve. He doesn't. This is very important. 4 times, same scenario. Why? Because Jesus allows difficulties to reveal himself. God allows difficulties in your life to reveal himself to you. You thought it has no point. Oh yeah, it serves God's purposes. So that we have a better picture of who God is, who his Son is, and as a result, we will have a reverence and fearful attitude toward God. And so today, as we study this passage and study Jesus' strength and power and authority, we should walk away with fear. And that's my dream, my prayer. We should learn how to fear God. And this is something less and less common. And I'm not talking about the world around. Oh, the world is not fearing God. They're ignoring God. But sadly, we should admit that even the lack of fear we observe in the Christian circles, people just care less. Hey, it's my choice. It's my life. Well, God is above all. He sees everything that all those choices you make. Oh, no, that's all right. Grace. And so today we need to refresh that. And Jesus does this with disciples. Imagine being with Jesus, losing the fear of him. Imagine us not seeing him face to face. Yes, we have the same trouble. So 3 valuable lessons on how to form or develop fear of the Lord. 3 steps toward fear of the Lord. Number 1, Jesus begins with teaching them to fear the storm. Fear of circumstances. Fear of circumstances. As I mentioned, Jesus could have just prevented that storm, and disciples could have grown with no idea what storm is like. Storm? Tell me what is it? Let me check Wikipedia. I don't know what storm is. You know what parents do? This is a very, very good strategy. We've used that. Now it's not applicable anymore with our kids. But if you have a child a year old, maybe 6 months old, you begin with using this strategy, which is, if you have stairs, let's say, in your house, you would let the child get to the edge of the stairs, and actually a good parent, carefully watching it, the whole process, would let the child fall on the first step. Literally. Maybe in the second, if the child is stubborn, maybe 2-3 steps. But you won't a good parent will not let the child roll all the way down. Please, don't misunderstand me, don't misapply it, okay? But the good parent will give a controlled dose of pain to prevent future huge mistakes. When you get busy and you just hear that someone just rolling all the way down, that can be a very dangerous, and you can see some social services after that. So to prevent that, you allow a mini storm in their life, so that next time they're just passing this dangerous zone, they just, I'll be happy in my room. Stairs are not fun anymore. That's how you train your kids, right? Or a hot stove top, right? There's a lot of good pens there and a lot of good stuff there. And you know that a child can pour over some hot water or whatever. And so you allow that child who's wondering to maybe even touch a little bit something hot on the stove. And so that next time, the perimeter of 10 feet, that child not even crawling or even thinking about the stove, because there was a little bit of pain, there was a little bit of anxiety. The lesson that Jesus provides is a similar one. He's in control. Oh yes, he's in control of storms. He's in control of everything. But he designed this storm. We're talking about the Sea of Galilee, or the lake specifically. It's 700 feet below the sea level, if I'm not mistaken, and it's surrounded by the mountains. And so Galilee, it's very hot there, and so the air directly above the lake, warms up, and it's very warm above the lake. But because of the high mountains and canyons in between those mountains and the ridges, the cold air comes in. And when a little bit of wind from either side brings the cold air and it collides with hot air above the lake, it creates a sudden, unexpected storm. And this is what I'm wondering. I was preparing. Could it be that God even designed the mountains and the lake beforehand so that He can teach this lesson? I'm a little bit maybe pushing it. But could it be, right? If God wants to teach disciples how to trust Him and He needs to storm, and let's design the lake when He created the earth and the mountains around it so that the lesson in Luke chapter 8 could take place. Nevertheless, if we still step back and look at this passage, look at the level of desperation the disciples have. As I mentioned in verse 24, they say, Master, Master, we are perishing. Now that's, kids, you cannot use this tomorrow morning. Parents, you're saying, school, we're perishing. That's a very desperate situation. That's a very desperate situation. That's not your school, okay, not your homework. This is when you are seeing face-to-face death. You say, ooh, it's not pretty. That's the word perishing. This is a good state of mind, by the way. So these men are humbled. You see, these are professional fishermen. They know this lake like the back of their hand. They know everything, and they're hopeless. They've tried everything. This is not them speaking to Jesus like, hey, you want to take the nap? We see like a little breeze is coming in. We just want to make sure, it's all comfortable, right? Why don't you pray and no storm? No, they stuck through the storm. They tried all the way to the point where they begin to sink. They're just going down. They're just going down. It's like, okay, this is the time when we need to wake him up. At least he's swimming out of the lake or out of the boat. So they tried everything, and they reached that point of helplessness. You see, those hardships that God brings about in your life, your illnesses, your weather, they're valuable. And it's not because we just like pain and we're as Christians, oh yeah, I lost my job, I feel so good, or I got sick, it's just amazing. No, we don't like pain. We don't like loss. But what it brings to our hearts is so valuable. See, friends, without difficulties, without trials, stresses, failure, you will never grow. God brings us to a deeper waters of grace, specifically through trials. Perhaps some of you are today in trials. You came and you failed. There's a certain storm in your life. This is not a mistake on God's side. It's not failure in heaven somewhere. God often does not keep us from the storms in order to keep us through the storms. Let me repeat myself. God often does not keep us from the storms in order to keep us through the storms. He allows that to reveal and prepare us to fear Him in a new way. By fearing first and dreading the storm that we are encountering. It awakens in us emotions, the ones that then He will direct toward Himself. James chapter 1. I want to read James' observation on this law that was at work in his own life. So James chapter 1, verse 2 through 5. Count it all joy, my brothers, when life is great, you get the paychecks, and you're on vacation. That's not... That's what in my Bible. I did a little textual criticism and I adjusted it. Highlighting, yeah. Michael has highlighted this. No. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials, storms in life of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. My question in verse, so he concludes that those trials, those storms in life are great because they produce a perfect character in us. They produce strength in faith. And then, but if any of you lacks wisdom, now many of you know Book of Proverbs. What is the beginning of wisdom? Loud. The fear of the Lord. So James leads it all the way to the fear of the Lord, wisdom. So those trials, testing of your faith, producing good character and perfection in you and maturing you leads to wisdom, which is the beginning of wisdom. James does the same. All to say, if we go back, Jesus, God in our lives right now, or maybe tomorrow, or a year from now, will bring about storms so that we learn to fear. Fear storms. Fear death. Fear disease. But if you just stuck there, you have not read the full story. Because disciples were desperate. They say, we are perishing. So Jesus led them to that conclusion. They're just broken down, hopeless, helpless. They cannot resolve this issue. He says, great, you feel this. Yeah, we're desperate for salvation. Great. Now I'm going to teach you to fear me. And so, fear of circumstances, that's a stepping stone. It gets our attention. Then that fear over that death or disease or anything else, Hurricane Ian or anything, it can be now taken and directed toward God himself. And this is our next step. Fear of God-man. Fear of God-man. Let's read now verses 23 and 24. And as they sailed, he fell asleep, and the windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with the water and were in danger. And they went and woke him, saying, Master, Master, we are perishing. And he awoke and rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was a calm. Read this passage as a person who is reading it for the first time. Christ has the power over wind, over storm, over nature? Wait a minute. I just read that he was asleep. He fell asleep. Now, by the way, this is unique because this is the only time in the New Testament in the Bible that Jesus mentioned sleeping. So it's a unique thing. In the parallel passage also, in other Gospels, when he was in a boat, that's the only time when Jesus is asleep. Not that he never slept. No, he was regularly sleeping. But this is intentionally kept for this because we read in chapter 8 and previous that he was so busy that even his mother and brothers came and says, hey, we want to see Jesus. But he was so busy with ministry and people that they even couldn't get to him. They would send a little text message, hey, brothers and sisters are here, I want to see. He says, no, and he's using even that incident to teach people. So he was working to the exhaustion. He was performing miracles. He was teaching, visiting people like Simon and spending time with people, and he was exhausted. And when he got to the boat, he felt like it's a cruise ship. That's it. Even though it's not comfortable. It's just wooden boards. Maybe a little pillow. But he was so dead tired, he just fell asleep right there on spot. So much so, it's not just someone is next to him snoring and like, oh, you bother me. He's not hearing anything, even the storm itself, when the boat is just all over. This is not your like, oh, I hear kids in the neighbor's house crying. No, this is storm, and he's sleeping. So he must be really tired. What kind of nature of Jesus is revealed through him being dead, tired, and asleep through the storm? What kind of nature we see here? You theologians, huh? Humanity. The word humanity, Jesus fully man. He's like you, man. Like you, man. I was thinking of myself because at night I hear nothing. And in the morning, just Arina wakes up and says, hey, there was a storm last night. Kids were crying. And I say, who calmed that storm? Not me, for sure. And so, man, you're sleeping through the night because you're a man, right? Jesus was like you, okay? He would sleep through the storm. So that's not an excuse for you guys not to help your wives when she's like, get up or I'm die. You get up and calm the storm, okay? Take the kids on yourself. But we see humanity of Jesus in this. He was so tired, he was asleep. But as soon as he is awakened, here comes the sea, the lake. What kind of nature of Jesus is revealed through his miracle of calming the sea? Huh? Divine nature. That's an interesting. Theologically, look at this. Man, like everyone else, dead, tired, sleeping through the storm, gets up and comes the lake and the sea and the wind and everything. Jesus is not 50% God, fully man. You see, it's an amazing combination of human and divine nature in Jesus Christ. He does not replace one nature with another, but they are combined in one unique way. You know what disciples forgot? What doctrine or what nature out of these two disciples forgot during the storm? Did they forget that he is a man? Or did they forget that he is the Son of God, God himself, divine? Which nature they kind of forgot about? Divine, absolutely. Because they saw a man sleeping right there. They were probably stepping over him, trying to resolve the issues and maybe pulling water, and maybe he was floating, I don't know, in the water because they were literally going down. They were sinking. So this is a very important observation, guys. During our troubles, our default problem is forgetting that Jesus is God, not that he's man. When we get in trouble, when we're in storm, when we have sickness, when death comes in, when the storm comes in, whatever the trouble is and trial is, we tend to do the same as disciples. Even though they were with him and they just saw a few hours ago a miracle after miracle, and they, at the time of trial, they forgot that right next to them is the Son of God. We repeat the same mistake. When the trials come, we suddenly forget that right next to us is the Son of God. Divinity of Christ. This is why the divinity of Christ must be preached by us without distortion and without any jumping over. Jesus is God. Because if we forget that, we'll say, we're perishing. Now, I like the word rebuke. Not that I like to rebuke people, but in chapter 8, verse 24. Look at verse 24. Master, master, we're perishing. And he awoke and rebuked the wind. I don't know how many of you tried to rebuke the wind. That's not a word usually used toward nature. Rebuking usually happens, this is the specific word for parenting. When a child misbehaves and the parent sees this misbehavior, you use that word rebuke. Come on, little boy. And you tell them what wrong they've done. And you call it rebuked. You rebuke your son. No. You don't do this. Stop doing this. No more misbehavior. Well, Jesus is rebuking misbehaving storm. Like a little child. Come on, what are you doing here? Stop. This is not, no. I want to get good rest. He rebuked the misbehaving storm. And the fear came in their hearts. He restored their understanding that Jesus is God. He probably went back to sleep to remind them, oh yeah, I'm a human as well. I need to finish my dreams. But what they needed to learn is his divinity, refreshed, reviewed. And this is where the fear is rooted. When he was sleeping and they looked at man, they were not filled with fear of Jesus. But when he woke up and revealed his divinity, they were filled and they were overcome with the fear. Why? Because they were standing before God-man. Fully God and fully man. This is doctrine. Doctrine matters. Theology matters, guys. When you get in the storm, your theology will come across. Couple examples of people catching that vision of Jesus as Lord and as God. I want to invite you to the Gospel of John, chapter 20. Thomas, a good friend of ours, right? Doubtful Thomas. When Jesus appeared, he wasn't there. He said, oh, I will not believe. And Jesus comes and says, look at me. Touch me. And then verse 28. Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God. This is in your Bibles as well, I hope. It's not been edited, crossed out. My God. A lot of people trying to confuse Jesus' identity and his nature. He is probably a good prophet and maybe a good man. My God. And you know what happened after that? This doubtful Thomas went on and died for Jesus as martyr. Now, if you're doubting, I don't know if he's alive, and now he goes and dies, must be something powerful. He encountered God himself. He says, my God. After that, he goes and dies for Jesus as a martyr. Colossians, another example. Now, this is the life of the church, and Paul writes to the church in Colossae, and he writes this. Colossians 1:15. Speaking of Jesus, he is the image of the invisible God. So God is the Spirit. We cannot see him, but Jesus is the visible God, the image of the visible God, the firstborn of all creation. Why would you mention this? There are a lot of things this statement is linked toward their life, but I want to link it to the end of this chapter where Paul says, this is because it has a meaning for my ministry. Verse 29, the very end of it. For this I toil, struggling with all his energy. His energy. Whose energy? Christ mentioned in verse 28, the very last person. Mature in Christ. So in his energy that he powerfully works within me. Now, the energy we're talking about, if we're talking about the energy of the prophet, a good preacher, good man, that energy level, I'm sorry, but it's not high. The energy level that we're talking about, Jesus, and Paul says that energy, that power that I'm working with is the energy and power that the Son of God provides. God Himself. Maybe this is why a lot of Christians are weak, because they just believe in half God, prophet, man. Only few who enjoy the doctrine of divinity of Jesus, because that's the power that overcomes everything else. Amazing. Friends, how accurate is your theology? Who is Christ for you? Is He a tired, sleeping man? Only? And He is? Or the Lord over the storm? God who has power over the nature. A third step, fear of unbelief. Fear of unbelief. Because this is what Jesus does, and there's an irony in verse 25. He said to them, "Where is your faith? Where is your faith?" The irony is that Jesus was not marveled and amazed by the storm. He just wakes up, "Oh, storm, okay, come down, guys." And then, "Disciples, I'm marveling and I'm so shocked that you have very little faith." So storm is not a big deal for Jesus. He's like, "Oh, storm, okay, to the side. Disciples, where's your faith?" We probably would be in the boat, like, "Oh, storm, and then calmness, amazing." Disciples, to the side. He puts the emphasis on their faith or lack of faith at that moment. No, they were believers. They trusted Him. They just forgot. They forgot that with them in the boat was Jesus, God, fully God and fully man. And if He is in your boat is unsinkable, believer. Listen, if Jesus is part of your life is unsinkable. How could you imagine that Jesus would go down in the water and sink? No, drown. No, not at all. So they had lack of faith. Interesting. The irony is also in disciples, because they were shocked and scared of the storm, but when Jesus comes, that storm, they are more scared of the rescue from the storm rather than of the storm itself. That's amazing. There's so much irony here. In all, to produce in disciples unshakable, real fear. All of this so that they were afraid. They were filled with fear. Lack of unbelief is a serious problem. We forget that. I want to read a passage that 3 groups of people used Jesus' power and talked about it to justify their unbelief. Matthew 26:38. Jesus is on the cross. I'm sorry, Matthew 27:38. Jesus is on the cross, and 3 groups of people speak of Jesus' power and strength in order to justify their unbelief. Amazing. How could people speak of His power and use it to justify their rejection of Jesus? Verse 38. Then 2 robbers were crucified with Him, one on the right and one on the left. And those who passed by derided Him, wagging their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself." So they're rebuking Him. "If you're the Son of God, come down from the cross." So they're saying, "You have power. You've said that you have power. Why don't you come down?" Also the chief priests and the scribes and the elders mocked him, saying, he saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God, let God deliver him if he desires him. For he said, I am the Son of God. And the robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him in the same way. They reviled, they mocked him, but they used his power. You know, there are people who can even talk about Jesus' power and yet be in unbelief. And this is what Jesus warns disciples. You've seen and you know, but I am marveled. Where's your faith? Where is your faith? As disciples, we have this default reaction when we encounter difficulties and storms in life. We begin to doubt whether he can help us. But Jesus and God allows the storms to have the opposite response, opposite reaction, is that we actually learn to fear him more and trust him more. An interesting illustration I have for you. There are all kinds of wavy or vines that are growing around big trees that we see this in our city. Let's take, for example, a big, powerful, strong oak, very old, 100-year-old oak tree. And there is a little vine that is growing on the side of it, okay? Imagine the storm that comes, and if the storm and the wind is from the opposite side of the vine, the tree trunk will protect that little vine from a powerful storm. And that vine, little vine by itself will never survive, but being on the oak will protect it with its stump, with this trunk, right? Thank you, trunk. Now, if the wind goes the direction that the vine is on, the effect of the wind actually will push the vine toward the trunk of the oak, and it will cling closer and closer to the tree. And at times, this is a good illustration of what Jesus does in our lives, because sometimes God will protect us from the storms of life. He stands in between the troubles and says, I will protect you, my child. As a strong oak. But at times, he allows the wind from opposite direction where that wind will push us, will move us to cling closer to the saving, powerful, strong oak. And this is what Jesus does here. With their lack of unbelief, he produces this fear and trust. They learn to depend on him. I know every service we have friends who are maybe first time in church, maybe you are new to Christianity and you're learning a lot. I want to speak to you because this story of awakening Jesus really is better to be called awakening of disciples. It is them who are awakened by this story. Jesus wakes them up. It's a wake up for the disciples to realize that the power and majesty only belongs to Jesus Christ. This story reveals Jesus Christ and his power to you. Only Jesus has the power to forgive. No one else. Even in their all best wishful thinking, they cannot forgive your sins. And you've tried it probably. Also, you've probably tried to change your own heart and be a better person. And you were very honest about it. But you realized not much changed. All you tried is just a little bit outward work, fixing. But the heart is still the same. Still the same. It's still evil. It's still doing all kinds of evil things. Only Jesus has the power even to change your heart. Only Jesus. And you need to understand that only Jesus can protect you and be that saving tree from the coming storm of eternal judgment. The judgment is coming. The judgment is coming.